June 13th, 1944, a warm morning in East London. Commuters hurry through Mile End, children chatter outside schools, and the city hums with cautious optimism. News from France is good. Allied troops have landed on the beaches of Normandy. After 5 long years, people dare to believe the end might be near. The Luftwaffe has been beaten back, air raid sirens are rare, and the shelters lie mostly quiet. Londoners are rebuilding their nerves, if not yet their homes. Then, somewhere over the southern horizon, comes a sound no one recognizes. A harsh, droning buzz, mechanical, uneven, unlike any aircraft before. It grows louder, steadier, until it seems to hang directly above the rooftops. Faces tilt upward. The noise cuts out suddenly. For a few seconds, there is silence. Then, a blinding flash, a concussion that ripples through the street, shattering windows for blocks. 8 people were killed in that first explosion. The newspapers the next day report it simply a new kind of German bomb. It is not until later that the whole truth emerges. The Germans have begun launching what they call Vergeltungswaffen, vengeance weapons. The first, known as the Phi-1 flying bomb, is unlike anything the city has faced. A pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine carrying a ton of high explosive. Launched from ramps hidden in northern France and the Low Countries, it flies on a preset course toward London. Its engine drones until the fuel runs out, then it dives and explodes. The attack marks a new phase of the war. The Blitz had ended nearly 3 years before, but the memory still lingers in every darkened window and patched wall. Civil defence forces, the wardens, rescue teams and fire brigades that once worked every night under the bombs, have not been disbanded, but their duties have been scaled back. By 1944, air raid precautions were routine more than urgent. London's vast network of shelters, observation posts and borough control rooms remains in place, a skeleton of readiness. The V1 changes that overnight. Reports stream into the Home Office and Anti-Aircraft Command. There is confusion. The new weapon is fast, low and unpredictable. Anti-aircraft guns calibrated for high-flying bombers struggle to track them. Fighter pilots scramble to intercept, but the object moves in a straight line just above their reach. Early defences fail. In the first week alone, hundreds of flying bombs crossed the Channel. Civil Defence headquarters in London must now adapt to an enemy that offers no warning. The air raid sirens tuned to bomber raids often sound too late. Wardens have seconds, not minutes, to act. Shelters fill again. Families carry bedding down into basements and underground stations. The city that had just begun to breathe again holds its breath once more. But this time, the mood is different. There is no sense of helplessness, no collapse of morale. People have lived through worse. The Blitz taught them how to endure. They sweep up the glass, report damage to the warden posts, and return to work. As one London official later noted, the people did not panic. They merely looked up and said, "Here we go again." Behind the scenes, the British government tries to understand the new threat. Scientists at Farnborough examine fragments of crashed V1s. Intelligence officers trace the arc of the attacks back to launch sites near Calais. Frederick Pyle, commander of Anti-Aircraft Command, orders guns and radar units moved south to intercept the flying bombs over the coast. Yet in London's borough control rooms, the work remains the same: locate casualties, coordinate rescue, clear debris, repair the roads and water mains. In many boroughs, civil defence is still run from the same rooms that served during the Blitz. Converted basements with maps pinned to the walls and phones linked to rescue depots. Wardens in tin helmets stand by for the next report. The coordination between local posts, police, fire services and hospitals must function at near-instant speed. And as in 1940, the strength of the system lies in its people, volunteers, clerks and engineers who have learned through bitter experience how to keep a city functioning under attack. The novelty of the weapon brings both anxiety and fascination. Newspapers print sketches of its shape: stubby wings, a cylindrical body, and a small jet pipe at the tail. Londoners nickname it the buzz bomb, or simply Doodlebug children imitate the street noise. Yet the dread it carries is very real. Everyone learns the sound of its engine, and the silence that follows. In government circles, the term V-weapon begins to circulate, followed by another code word, crossbow, for the Allied countermeasures intended to destroy the launch sites. Intelligence officers warn that this may be only the beginning. Rumours spread of a second, even more advanced weapon. A rocket capable of travelling faster than the speed of sound. Few believe it at first. By midsummer, London's defences are stretched but holding. Anti-aircraft gunners are improving. Fighter pilots are learning to tip the bombs off course with their wings, and civil defence teams are managing the chaos with grim efficiency. Still, the toll rises. By early July, hundreds of Londoners had been killed and thousands of homes had been damaged. In the borough of Suffolk, one of the hardest-hit wardens record multiple incidents in a single night, with entire streets flattened. The authorities understand that this is a different kind of war, not one of raids and intervals, but of continuous pressure. The enemy has found a way to wage war solely through machinery, and that perhaps is what unsettles people most. The sense of impersonal menace, a bomb that flies itself. Yet as days pass, adaptation becomes routine. The ARP services refine their procedures. Rescue squads respond within minutes of impact, trained dogs help locate survivors, and repair crews patch gas lines and water mains before dawn. The machinery of civil defence, once feared to be obsolete, proves vital again. Still, beneath the surface, there is unease. The V1 is terrifying, but at least it is visible and audible, something to hear and fight. The intelligence reports hint that the Germans have developed something beyond even that, a weapon that gives no warning at all. For now, though, the people of London look skyward at the streaks of the buzz bombs, counting seconds between the cut of the engine and the crash that follows. The city braces and endures. But in the quiet moments between attacks, a question lingers in every mind. If this is only the first of the V weapons, what will come next? A device that flies itself. That, in essence, is what the V1 represented. But to the men and women of 1944, it was far more than a technical curiosity. It was a promise of a new kind of warfare. To understand what London faced, one must first understand the machines Germany had built to strike it. The V1, or Fieseler FY-103, was the world's first operational cruise missile. Its heart was a simple pulse jet engine that throbbed with a rhythmic mechanical cough, one explosion after another propelling it forward at nearly 400 miles per hour. Under its stubby wings hung a warhead of nearly a ton of high explosive. The entire device was launched from a ramp, catapulted by steam, and guided only by a crude gyroscopic compass and an automatic pilot. When it ran out of fuel, the engine stopped and gravity took over. From the ground, it looked like a small aircraft without a pilot. From the streets of London, it sounded like a clock counting down. The buzz meant danger was coming, but the silence meant impact was seconds away. For months before D-Day, British intelligence had been aware that something was happening across the Channel. Reconnaissance photographs revealed strange ramp-like structures in northern France. Analysts at the Air Ministry called them ski sites, unsure of their purpose. Reports from the French resistance hinted at the movement of long, cylindrical objects under heavy guard. By spring 1944, the mystery had a name, the V-weapon program, short for Vergeltungswaffe, weapon of revenge. The first of these weapons was the V1, but it was only part of a larger vision. Engineers at Peenemünde, under Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, were developing a second machine, one that would surpass all previous technology. This was the A4 rocket, later named the V2. It stood nearly 15 meters tall, powered by liquid oxygen and alcohol, capable of reaching the edge of space before plunging back to Earth at supersonic speed. Unlike the V1, it could not be heard, seen, or intercepted. It was the first ballistic missile in history. In Hitler's mind, these wonder weapons would reverse the course of the war. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, hundreds of V1 launch ramps were ready along the French coast. Within days, the first of them began firing toward London. Each weapon was cheap to make, devastating when it struck, and terrifyingly efficient in psychological terms. German crews operated the V-1 sites under constant danger. Allied bombers and fighter bombers scoured the Channel coast daily, targeting the ramps and supply convoys. Yet the Germans were ingenious in repair. Within hours of an air raid, a destroyed site might be rebuilt. Even as the Allies advanced through France, new mobile launchers appeared in the Low Countries. Behind the German front lines, another battle was being fought, one of intelligence and deception. The British network of double agents, coordinated by MI5's XX Committee, had already been used to mislead the Germans about the D-Day landings. Now, these same agents were used again, feeding false reports about the fall points of the V-1s. The idea was simple. If German planners believed their weapons were overshooting London, they would adjust the aim backward, causing more bombs to fall short into open countryside. Whether the deception truly saved central London is debated, but at the time, officials believed it worked. On the British side, Anti-Aircraft Command had to rethink its entire defensive concept. The Blitz had taught them how to shoot down bombers at altitude. The V-1 demanded low-angle, fast-tracking fire. Radar had to be recalibrated. Gun sights were moved south and east along the coast to intercept the flying bombs before they reached the capital. Even the new jet-propelled fighters of the Royal Air Force, such as the Meteor, were thrown into the hunt. Pilots learned to tip the bombs off balance with their wingtips, a dangerous but sometimes effective tactic. Still, hundreds of V-1s made it through. Some exploded in the suburbs, others in the city's heart. Each carried not only destruction, but a new kind of fear, the fear of automation, of a weapon that no human hand controlled once it left the ramp. It was a glimpse into the future of warfare. Then, in September 1944, a different soundless danger appeared. Early in the morning of the 8th, without warning, a massive explosion ripped through Staveley Road in Chiswick, West London. No sirens, no drone, no approach, just impact. At first, authorities thought it was a gas main explosion, but when fragments were examined, the truth was unmistakable. The first V-2 rocket had struck Britain. This weapon changed everything. Travelling faster than the speed of sound, it could not be detected or intercepted. It rose into the edge of space, arced over the North Sea, and fell back at nearly 3,000 miles per hour. By the time anyone heard the blast, the missile had long since arrived. The V-2 required enormous resources, liquid fuel plants, underground assembly lines, mobile launch units, and yet the Germans persisted even as the war turned against them. They saw it as a final gesture of defiance, a technical marvel that might, in Hitler's words, bring England to her knees. For Londoners, it brought a new kind of helplessness. The V-1 could at least be heard, seen, and fought. The V-2 was invisible. A few seconds separated peace from devastation. There was no warning, no defense, no way to hide. And yet even as fear grew, so did defiance. Civil defense authorities, scientists, and the ordinary people of London began to study this new enemy, as they had the last, methodically, practically, determined to adapt. For all its novelty, the V-2 would not have the effect its creators promised. Its accuracy was poor, its numbers limited, and its terror, while real, failed to break the spirit of a city that had already survived the Blitz. But in the autumn of 1944, no one knew that yet. They only knew that the war had entered another strange and perilous phase, one in which the enemy's machines arrived faster than thought itself. As fragments of rockets were gathered from the smoking craters of London streets, a question arose in the minds of those responsible for the city's safety. How could civil defense, built for sirens, for fires, for raids, face a weapon that gave no warning at all? The answer would be tested in the months to come, as London's civil defense system prepared for its most difficult trial since the nights of 1940. Civil defense had never been a single institution. It was a vast, improvised organism that stretched from Whitehall to the smallest borough post. Long before the first V-weapon fell, London had built this organism from the lessons of earlier wars and the bitter experience of 1940. The story began in 1935 when the British government, watching the rise of air power in Europe, created the Air Raid Precautions Organisation, ARP. Its mission was to prepare civilians for attack from the sky. Training manuals, gas masks, and blackout curtains were the visible signs of a new kind of defence, one fought not by armies but by ordinary citizens. By the time the Blitz began in 1940, London's civil defence system had already been tested in theory. Now it had to prove itself in practice. By 1944, the structure was familiar, if worn by years of strain. At the top stood the Home Office and its regional commissioners. Beneath them, the London region is divided into boroughs, each with its own control centre, usually a converted basement packed with maps, telephones, and the steady buzz of message runners. Wardens patrolled their streets, rescue parties stood ready in depots, and the fire guard service watched the skies. Every warden's post was a nerve ending of the system. When a bomb fell, the wardens were first to arrive, counting casualties, directing ambulances, marking dangerous buildings, and sending reports back to the borough control room. From there, the message passed up the chain, to the regional office, to the ministry, and if necessary to anti-aircraft command or the air ministry itself. The rhythm of war on the home front was bureaucratic but vital, every message, every line on a map, part of the pulse that kept a city alive under fire. The lull between 1941 and 1944, after the Great Raids had ended, had threatened to dissolve this machine. Volunteers drifted away, morale waned. Many in government debated whether the ARP was still necessary, yet in some boroughs, particularly in the south and east, the posts never closed. Southwark, Bermondsey, Lewisham, these districts, already scarred by the Blitz, kept their wardens on duty. When the V1s came, they were among the first to respond. At the Southwark Borough Control, the maps were still pinned to the walls. When the first reports of flying bombs arrived in mid-June 1944, the system sprang back to life. Sirens were sounded, rescue parties dispatched, and the fire service alerted. It was as if the long sleep of the interwar lull had ended in an instant. But the new enemy posed new problems. Traditional air raid precautions assumed a time, minutes between the siren and impact, enough to herd people into shelters and alert the fire brigades. The V1 allowed no such grace. Its speed meant that by the time a warning could be issued, the bomb might already be falling. London's intricate warning system had to be rethought. Radar and coast-watching stations began feeding real-time data to the civil defence region, which then relayed alerts borough by borough. Wardens learned to trust the strange, rasping engine sound more than the official signals. Shelters, too, needed adaptation. During the Blitz, thousands had lived for months underground in the London Underground stations, in public shelters, and in Anderson huts buried in gardens. The V weapons produced a different pattern of damage: shorter raids, heavier explosions, greater shock waves. Engineers reinforced shelter entrances, deepened trenches, and inspected basements that had been left unused for years. Civil defence was not only about safety, it was about the rapid restoration of order. After every strike, survey officers recorded damage in triplicate. Repair teams, nicknamed first aid parties, patched water mains, gas lines, and power cables within hours. The London County Council maintained emergency depots stocked with timber, corrugated iron, and tarpaulins for makeshift repairs. The aim was always the same: to make a house habitable by nightfall, even if only a single room remained intact. For civilians, life adapted in small ways. Children learned to recognize the rising buzz of a flying bomb. Families returned to the habit of sleeping underground. Wardens went door to door, checking blackout curtains that had long since faded from use. Women's voluntary service units reopened their mobile canteens to serve tea at bomb sites. Not everything worked smoothly. The new speed of attacks overwhelmed the communication lines. Borough offices sometimes learned of strikes only when their own windows blew in. Supplies of sandbags and timber, depleted by years of rationing, had to be scavenged, and the endless fatigue, after years of war, took its toll. Yet the system held. It held because the people within it knew their roles, and because London had, by necessity, become a city that could repair itself. In the quieter hours between raids, the wardens' posts often fell silent except for the tick of the telephones. Reports of minor incidents, gas leaks, or false alarms trickled in. Then the buzz of another V1 would send everyone into motion again. The rhythm of endurance resumed. Impact, rescue, repair, report, rest. The work of civil defence during the V-weapon campaign was largely invisible. There were no grand offensives, no medals for gallantry beyond local commendations. Yet its effect was immense. It gave the city resilience, a structure through which shock could be absorbed and turned into action. Even so, beneath the calm professionalism, unease lingered. The V1, for all its speed, could be fought, spotted, intercepted, diverted. But the new weapon, the one rumoured to travel faster than sound, would change that equation. The wardens and officers of London's civil defence network, veterans of the Blitz and now of the flying bomb summer, would soon face a threat against which all their drills and sirens were powerless. And when that threat arrived, it would do so without a single warning sound. The drone stopped, and in the silence that followed, London braced itself. For months, the city had lived beneath the strange rhythm of the V1 campaign, but now another kind of destruction was falling, invisible and unstoppable. By autumn 1944, the pattern of the war had shifted. Allied armies were advancing through France, closing on Germany's borders. Yet even as liberation spread across Europe, the bombardment of London began anew. The first V2 rockets struck in September. No sirens, no drone, no flash of wings in the sky, only the sudden roar of impact and the deafening concussion that followed. On Staveley Road in Chiswick, a suburban morning was torn apart. 3 people were killed, 17 were injured, and houses were reduced to rubble without a hint of warning. In the weeks that followed, more rockets fell, and the pattern of terror took shape. The explosion first, the sound second. For Londoners, this was a bewildering reversal. The Blitz had taught them to watch the skies, to listen for the siren. The V1 had offered even a grim kind of predictability. Its engine's cough gave a moment to react. The V2 offered nothing at all. As one warden noted in his report, you did not hear them coming. You were either dead or you were alive. Between June 1944 and March 1945, more than 9,000 V1s were launched against Britain. Roughly 2,400 reached London. In that same period, over 1,300 V2s followed, many striking the capital. The scale of destruction was staggering. Historic England later estimated that more than 1.5 million homes were damaged or destroyed in the campaign. Entire streets vanished overnight. The pattern of impact told its own story. The V1s, crude but steady, tended to fall in the southern suburbs. Lewisham, Croydon, Peckham and Southwark bore the brunt. The V2s, launched from mobile sites in Holland, struck without pattern, north, south, west at random. Each borough lived with its own fear. In Woolworth's New Cross on November 25, 1944, a busy Saturday morning turned into one of the worst single civilian tragedies of the war. The shop was packed with shoppers. A V2 landed directly on the building. The explosion killed 168 people and injured hundreds more. It was an instant catastrophe, so sudden that nearby streets thought it had been an earthquake. Rescue parties worked through the night, pulling survivors from the debris while fires still smouldered beneath their feet. For the men and women of civil defence, these were the longest months of the war. The pace of work never slackened. Rescue crews no longer had the comfort of the warning siren. They could be hit even while working at one bomb site. One team in Battersea was killed by a second rocket that fell only minutes after they arrived. Fire brigades faced a new challenge. The V2's explosion created enormous craters, ruptured gas and water mains, and left fires burning deep underground. Emergency services had to improvise new techniques, pumping out flooded basements and using cranes to shift masonry too heavy for manual rescue. Hospitals overflowed again. Many had just recovered from the Blitz years, their windows reglazed, wards reopened. Now they faced another wave of casualties. Ambulance drivers, many of them women volunteers, worked without pause, morgues filled, and identification teams had to sift through wreckage that bore no warning signs, no time for evacuation. Yet amid the exhaustion, there was continuity. The ARP wardens still recorded every strike, noting street addresses, times, and casualty estimates in precise handwriting. Borough engineers still marked damage with coloured chalk, red for dangerous, yellow for repairable. Council offices still dispatched surveyors and social workers to find temporary housing for the displaced. The machine of civil defence, designed years earlier, continued to function, an act of quiet defiance in itself. Life on the surface struggled to maintain its rhythm. Schools reopened in undamaged districts. Buses ran, shops traded, theatres performed to half-empty audiences. The war had become a daily coexistence with danger. Some Londoners joked darkly that they preferred the rockets to the Doodlebugs. At least there was no time to be afraid. Others found the silence unnerving. The absence of warning made even the calmest day feel uncertain. Still, hope flickered. By late 1944, reports filtered through that Allied troops were overrunning the launch zones in France and Belgium. Each mile of liberation meant fewer weapons fired. Newspapers printed cautious optimism. The bombardment, they said, would soon end. But the reprieve was short-lived. As the Germans retreated, they moved their launch units eastward, using mobile platforms that could fire from deep within the Netherlands. London's ordeal was far from over. The emotional toll grew heavy. After 5 years of war, the city was tired, physically, psychologically, spiritually. For many, the new attacks felt like a cruel twist of fate, an aftershock of a war that should already have been won. Yet beneath that fatigue, the stubborn London spirit endured. Neighbours helped each other clear rubble. Church halls hosted impromptu shelter concerts. Wardens and rescue workers returned to duty night after night. In the minutes after each explosion, silence would hang over the streets, broken only by the crackle of fires and the voices of rescue teams calling out. Then came the familiar routines: stretchers, ladders, water hoses, the smell of dust and plaster. Civil defence, as ever, was about restoring order to chaos. By the winter of 1944-45, the rocket attacks were at their peak. Dozens fell each week, hitting Woolwich, Tottenham, Whitechapel, Stepney. The randomness was part of the terror. Nowhere felt safe. Still, London refused to empty. Shelters filled again, though fewer stayed all night. People slept lightly, half expecting the ground to shake. The war was turning in the Allies' favour. In February 1945, as British and American forces crossed the Rhine, rumours spread that the V-weapon campaign was nearly over. The final rocket to hit Britain fell on March 27, 1945, striking Orpington in Kent. 2 days later, an explosion in East London marked the last recorded enemy action on British soil. The campaign had lasted barely 10 months, but in that time it had scarred the capital anew, physically, emotionally, and architecturally. The streets of South London bore the worst of it. Entire neighbourhoods would later be rebuilt from the ground up. For the civil defence workers who had endured from the first Blitz to the final rocket, it felt like the closing of a grim circle. The war had begun with fire from the sky and ended with fire from space. But in between, London had learned how to survive almost anything. And yet, as the city emerged into peace, one question lingered in every debriefing room and borough hall. How do you defend civilians against weapons faster than sound? The answer would shape not only the post-war future of civil defence, but the future of warfare itself. By the spring of 1945, the skies above London had grown strangely quiet. The last V-2 rocket had fallen, the sirens were silent again, and the city, bruised but standing, began to exhale. Across the Channel, Allied armies were breaking through the Rhine. The German rocket sites were being overrun one by one. For most Londoners, it was finally possible to believe that the end was near. Yet even in those final weeks, the work of civil defence continued. The rescue squads, the wardens, the engineers and clerks, none could stand down until the danger was truly past. The last rocket struck in March, and though no one could be sure it was over, the frequency of attacks dropped sharply. Reports from Holland confirmed what everyone had hoped. The German launch units were retreating or had been captured. Still, the toll was immense. Since the first V1 had hit 9 months earlier, over 8,000 Londoners had been killed by the V-weapons and tens of thousands injured. Whole districts, Woolwich, New Cross, Lewisham, Stepney and Battersea, had been reshaped by the destruction. More than 1.5 million homes were damaged or destroyed. To the officials in the London Civil Defence region, it was the most significant single test of their system since the Blitz. Now, that system faced a different kind of pressure, not sudden impact, but exhaustion. Many of the wardens and rescue workers had been serving since 1939. Their uniforms were worn thin, their posts undermanned. Bomb site fatigue had set in, the kind of weariness that seeps into the bones after years of clearing rubble and counting losses. One senior officer described it simply: the spirit was willing, but the body had had enough. Resources, too, were vanishing. The army demanded manpower for the final campaign in Europe. Industrial output was being diverted toward the invasion of Germany, and supplies for civil defence, sandbags, timber, fuel, became scarce. The Home Office, while still issuing directives, began quietly planning for demobilisation. In the corridors of the London regional headquarters, talk turned from response to recovery. For the city's population, survival had become routine. The shelters were still maintained, but fewer people went underground now. They had learned to live with the uncertainty, to move through shattered streets as if it were normal life. Markets reopened beside cratered buildings, buses detoured around demolition zones, children played among the ruins, their games echoing across the empty lots. Yet there was also a new awareness of what had changed. The V1 had been mechanical, almost clumsy. The V2 was something else entirely, a glimpse of warfare's future. Officials at the Ministry of Home Security understood this. They gathered data obsessively: blast patterns, crater dimensions, the structural limits of buildings under supersonic impact. These reports would later inform studies on urban resilience and Cold War-era shelter design. In the boroughs, repair crews worked around the clock. The first aid repair principle, patching roofs, boarding windows, reconnecting utilities, remained in force. Every habitable room meant one less family displaced. The Ministry of Works deployed emergency housing units, prefabricated prefabs, that would become a familiar sight across post-war London. Many stood for decades longer than intended. Meanwhile, the morale machine that had sustained London through the Blitz was running on habit. The wireless carried cautious optimism, but most Londoners were too tired for celebration. When victory finally came in May 1945, the joy that swept Trafalgar Square was tempered by remembrance. Beneath the flags and singing lay the memory of those 10 months when the sky itself had turned hostile. For the men and women of civil defence, VE Day was bittersweet. Their work was ending, but not their duty. In the following weeks, thousands were assigned to relief and clearance operations, recovering unexploded ordnance, demolishing unsafe ruins, and tracing missing persons. Others were transferred to assist the Housing Ministry in the rebuilding effort. The war in Europe was over, but the reconstruction of London had only begun. As the paperwork of peace replaced the reports of raids, a quiet reckoning began. The city had endured not one but 2 distinct air wars. The first had been the Blitz, long nights of fire, where warning and shelter offered a kind of defence. The second had been the V-weapon campaign, sudden, arbitrary, mechanical. Both had tested the same endurance system, and in both it had held. Still, there was unease among the planners. If rockets could cross the Channel, what could the next war bring? The British government established committees to study the implications of supersonic attack. The question was no longer how to fight in the air, but how to protect those on the ground. Civil defence, once born of the biplane and the bomb, was entering the missile age. For the ordinary Londoner, these were distant thoughts. Their task was more straightforward: to rebuild. The sound of hammers replaced the sound of engines. Scaffolds rose where houses had stood. Slowly, the city began to knit itself back together. The V-weapon scars were still visible, ragged gaps along rows of terraced houses, abrupt modern buildings where the old had been lost, but life flowed around them. When the last of the rescue posts closed that summer, many volunteers left behind their steel helmets and armbands as mementos. They had seen the war from the doorstep, from the cellar, from the street. They had witnessed the transformation of warfare and the resilience of a city. The rockets had ceased, the rubble was being cleared, and the long night of the war was ending. But the lessons of London's defence, its organisation, its improvisation, its unyielding endurance, would echo far beyond 1945. As the world entered the nuclear age, every planner and policymaker would look back to this moment, to the city that had faced the first missiles, and ask, what must we learn before it happens again? The V-weapon campaign was over, the city endured, but the questions it raised about technology, vulnerability, and the human capacity to endure the unimaginable had only just begun to unfold. When the noise finally stopped, London was left standing amid silence and dust. The war in Europe was over, but beneath the celebrations, the city carried invisible wounds, psychological, architectural, and institutional. The V-weapon campaign had not only battered streets and homes, it had tested the entire concept of civil defence itself. In the first months of peace, government officials sifted through piles of reports, borough wardens' logs, rescue schedules, casualty lists, damage assessments. All were gathered to evaluate what had worked and what had failed. The statistics told a blunt story: tens of thousands killed and injured, more than 1 million homes destroyed or damaged, entire neighbourhoods erased from the map. Yet, despite the devastation, the machinery of London's defence had never collapsed. It had bent, adapted, and kept functioning until the last weapon fell. That endurance became the foundation for the post-war reckoning. The Home Office convened inquiries to examine lessons for future emergencies. The findings were clear. Decentralisation had worked. Local control rooms, those borough basements filled with phones and maps, had proven indispensable. So had the volunteer corps, the wardens and fire guards who knew every street and every family. In the age of automation and rockets, human networks remained the strongest defence. The civilian experience also left deep marks on public consciousness. The war had blurred the line between soldier and civilian, battlefield and home. For Londoners, survival itself had been a collective act of citizenship. Ordinary people had learned how to protect, rescue, and rebuild one another. That idea would echo in Britain's post-war welfare reforms, in the sense that government owed something tangible to the people who had stood the watch at home. But there were darker legacies too. The V-weapons had revealed the limits of human preparation. No amount of sirens or shelters could stop a supersonic rocket. Civil defence planners understood this grim truth. Within a few years, they were studying new diagrams, not of flying bombs, but of atomic blast zones. The V2 had been a bridge from the age of firestorms to the age of flash and radiation. What London had endured in 1944 to 45 was, in hindsight, the prelude to the nuclear century. Still, the lessons of the wartime system remained vital. In 1948, Britain established a renewed civil defence corps, built on the wartime model of volunteers and borough coordination. Its purpose was to prepare for future attacks, no longer by planes or rockets, but potentially by atomic bombs. Many of its trainers were veterans of the London region, men and women who had served in warden posts or rescue squads. Their experience, how to maintain order, how to communicate, how to preserve morale, became the core of a new doctrine for an uncertain world. For historians, the V-weapon campaign came to symbolize the collision of two eras. The Blitz had been an industrial war, noisy, visible, human. The rocket campaign was a technological war, automated, mathematical, detached, and yet the same human responses, courage, exhaustion, community, recurred in both. The technology changed, the people did not. In the years that followed, London rebuilt itself over its scars. Streets once cratered by rockets became new housing estates. The Woolworths site at New Cross, where 168 had died in a single instant, reopened as a modern shopping district. Each new building stood as both memorial and renewal. Few plaques marked the impact points. Most Londoners preferred to move forward. But beneath the new facades, the memory of the V weapons persisted, quietly, like the echo of a distant engine. For the veterans of civil defence, their war had never been one of glory. They had no parades, few decorations. Their battles were fought with shovels, stretchers, and telephones. Yet their discipline and improvisation had saved thousands of lives. They had kept the city's heart beating when machinery and technology tried to break it. As Britain entered the Jet Age and the Cold War, the story of London's wartime defence became a manual for survival. The reports on shelter construction, emergency repair, and public morale were studied by planners designing the next generation of civil defence systems. The principle was simple but profound. Technology may change the form of attack, but resilience still depends on people, on communication, preparation, and calm under pressure. The V-Weapons campaign also reshaped the global imagination. The German rockets that terrorized London would later inspire space exploration. Werner von Braun, once the engineer of destruction, became the architect of the Saturn rockets that sent humans to the moon. The same equations that had carried explosives across the Channel now carried astronauts across the sky. It was one of history's sharpest ironies. Weapons built to break a city had opened the path beyond the Earth. In London, the last official wartime ARP post closed in 1946. The final reports were filed away, stamped complete. Yet for many who had lived through it, the sound of that first buzz bomb, the stuttering engine that cut suddenly into silence, remained unforgettable. It was the sound of technology changing the rules of war and of humanity struggling to keep pace. Today, the story of the V-Weapons and London's civil defence is not only a history of destruction, but of adaptation. It shows how ordinary people, faced with the most advanced weapons of their age, learned to respond with organisation, creativity, and endurance. The rockets fell, the bombs stopped, but the systems they challenged, the will to resist, to rebuild, to defend the living, did not. In the end, London survived not because it could stop the V-Weapons, but because it could absorb their impact and rise again. The city endured the first age of missiles, and from its ruins came lessons that would shape how the modern world prepares for catastrophe. The buzz of the engines has faded, but the echoes remain, in the architecture, in the archives, and in the quiet conviction that no weapon, however advanced, can erase the resilience of a city that refuses to fall. The war was over, but the questions it left behind refused to fade. For the first time in human history, technology had made distance meaningless, and civilians had become the front line. The V1 and V2 campaigns were not just an episode in the closing months of the Second World War, they were a signal of the world to come. London's civil defence officials knew it. In the weeks after victory, as the rubble was cleared and normal life stumbled back into place, the Home Office quietly commissioned a series of internal reports. How effective had shelters been? How long could people endure continuous bombardment? How had morale held up under weapons no one could see or hear? The answers, compiled from hundreds of borough and regional documents, painted a complex picture, one of ingenuity, fatigue, and a kind of disciplined endurance that had surprised even those who planned it. The city had not been prepared for rocket warfare, yet somehow it had met it. The same wartime system that had begun in 1935 with simple air raid precautions had evolved through trial, error, and necessity into a model for urban resilience. It was proof that even in the age of automation, survival depended on people, on wardens who knew their streets, on neighbours who shared what little they had, on engineers who patched the city's veins before dawn. These lessons shaped the decades that followed. In 1948, when Britain created the new Civil Defence Corps to prepare for the atomic age, it was built directly on the London wartime framework. Its training manuals were based on ARP field reports, its organisation mirrored the old borough posts, and its ethos, calm under pressure, communication above panic, came straight from the V-weapon years. Across Europe and North America, urban planners studied London's response to see how modern cities might withstand sudden, large-scale attack. But there was another legacy too, one written in technology rather than policy. The V-weapons had transformed warfare into engineering. Their makers, many of them scientists rather than soldiers, had proven that equations could replace squadrons, that terror could be delivered by trajectory. Within a decade, the same mathematics would launch satellites instead of explosives. The line from the ruins of Peenemünde to the launch pads of Cape Canaveral was short and morally tangled. The dream of flight beyond Earth had been born from engines first tested in London. For those who had lived beneath those engines, the transformation was hard to reconcile. In the 1950s, as newspapers celebrated the dawn of the space age, Londoners who had survived the V2s could still point to the sites where those same machines had torn the ground open. The technology that had once symbolized annihilation now promised exploration. But the memory of its first purpose, vengeance, lingered in the background. Architecturally, the aftermath of the V-weapon campaign helped shape modern London. The vast rebuilding of the south and east, where most of the flying bombs had fallen, created new housing estates, schools and roads. Planners seized the opportunity to redesign bomb-damaged areas along modernist lines. Wider streets, stronger foundations, more light and air. From the wreckage of destruction came the blueprint for a new city, yet beneath every layer of post-war renewal lay traces of the old wounds. A park in Lewisham, a car park in New Cross, a playground in Stepney. Each concealed a crater that had once been a rocket impact. Even today, the city carries these faint scars, visible only to those who know where to look. For historians, the V-weapon story became a parable about adaptation. The weapons themselves were revolutionary, but the response was profoundly human. London's civil defence system showed that resilience was not a product of technology, but of trust. The trust between neighbours, the confidence in local leaders, the belief that even if the next strike could not be stopped, someone would be there to help. That ethos became the city's quiet inheritance. When new crises came, floods, fires, bombings of later decades, the memory of those wartime networks informed how Londoners reacted. The legacy of civil defence was not the concrete of shelters or the paperwork of control rooms. It was the habit of collective endurance. Looking back, the V-weapon campaign stands as a turning point, the moment when warfare's future arrived early, and when a city's defences were tested against both steel and fear. The rockets fell faster than sound, but they did not break the rhythm of response, rescue, repair, resilience. From the first buzz bomb to the last rocket, London learned to confront the unknown, not with panic, but with pattern and purpose. The war's architects may have seen the V-weapons as instruments of vengeance, but in the end they revealed something else entirely, the limits of terror and the strength of those it tried to destroy. The rockets silenced the sky, yet they also exposed the quiet power of ordinary order, a warden's whistle, a fireman's hose, a neighbour's outstretched hand. 80 years later, the story endures as both a warning and a testament. Technology will always race ahead of defence, and each generation will face its own version of the V-weapon, swift, impersonal, and new. But the response, if history is any guide, will come from the same place, the collective will of people who refuse to yield. For London, that is the final legacy of its civil defence, not the weapons that fell upon it, but the resolve that rose beneath them, a city remade by war, rebuilt by endurance, and remembered still for the moment when the future arrived on fire and was met calmly by the courage of the ordinary.